Hi everyone, this is Germinal founder of GGV Publishing and your host for the GGV Publishing Podcast. Today we have a special guest, Andrew Corbley. He wrote the book On the Face of It. Andrew, welcome to the GGV Publishing Podcast. How are you doing
Well,
today?
thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, you are a traveler. Your story is quite fascinating. Why don't you introduce yourself to those who don't know you yet?
Well, I'd like to call myself a reporter because journalism requires a lot more work than I do. I just report often on what other journalists do. But no, I started traveling the world as soon as I picked up this career in reporting. It was always a passion of mine, but for a very mm, wasn't it didn't have deep roots. It came along in my adult life. But as soon as I realized that everything I did for a living, I did from a computer, I sold everything I had and started traveling the world. But the real, it was an interesting origin, because sometimes things can happen. I don't mean to immediately get deeply philosophical, but sometimes things can happen in your life that you really don't understand the meaning of, and you need a lot of time to unravel them. And so for me, it was like a backpacking trip across Europe that I did as part of a request from my mother because my sister was doing it, and she was worried that a young girl alone wouldn't be responsible enough. And I remember the impact of 2.5 months just living out of a backpack was like really impactful, but I didn't have the mental capabilities to like translate that experience into what it meant. Because what had happened was when I came back, it felt like there was some giant void or some noise that I couldn't exactly place where it was coming from. I just felt completely distracted. So I eventually realized that was like this really deep-seated desire to travel and see the world. And so I started to do that more and more. And then I started writing. And then I left in November 2019 to Africa. After just in that next month, I met the woman who would become my wife. She was Italian. I moved to Italy. I started my own news publishing company, and I wrote a book because I was trying to turn my travel experiences, of which there were a great number of deep value, into something more than just a news piece. And there are some travelers who write books. There are some very accomplished travelers who do public speaking. I aspire to be like that. I thought a book was a great place to start, especially because these profound experiences began to stack up in such a way that I felt like I had to do something with them now, because if I allow myself to travel for another 5 or 6 years, they would become so numerous that to put them all in a single book or all in a single piece of media would really dilute some of the power of the messaging that I felt they had. So, in the year that my son was born and that I turned 30, I wrote a book. And based on about 18, well, no, let's say 10 months of traveling, you know, cut apart into different countries in different years. And I've been to about, yeah, around 30 countries. And I think that there are a lot of people, and I've met some of them who have traveled an awful lot more than I have. But I feel that maybe I have some kind of ability to put really unique experiences into words in
There's
a
one
way
question I want
others
to
can't.
ask you, real quick. So you said you met your wife on a trip in Africa. Do you remember in which country you guys met back in Africa?
Yeah, I wanted to go to Africa and but I just didn't have any knowledge of the continent. So I went with a gut feeling, which was that I wanted to go see a desert, and so I went to Namibia.
Interesting. Okay. The Kalahari Desert.
Yeah, or the Namib Naukluft. And my wife was there because she has like a remote adoption program with these three young children who are come from really unfortunate backgrounds. And so she was there, um, really not a not a traveler, as she's an equestrian and a lawyer, so not doesn't have a lot of time to travel in her life, but she was there taking them on like a bit of a vacation. And we
Yeah.
just happened to meet in the same hostel.
So how do you manage now that you have a child? Like how do you manage the traveling? Traveling is your passion. You pretty much dedicated your life to, and you will still dedicate your life to it until you probably, until you can physically no longer do travel, right? So far, like, do you leave your child at home, or does the child come with you and you guys all travel together? How you manage that?
The first thing I want to say is that growing up on the East Coast of the United States, I remember distinctly a very child negative experience through adolescence and early adulthood. Nobody was ever aspiring to have kids. And I remember most people seemed to refer to children as some kind of burden. They were something to put away until your 30s or mid 30s after you had had fun or had a career or something. But aside from being, the most fantastic thing on this earth, they are not, it is not as great an impediment as some might think. I mean, you could certainly make parenting a real full-time impediment, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And so what we do is last year I had one big trip was to Azerbaijan, and we went I just made as many preparations as I could to make everything as comfortable as possible for my wife. And it were difficult at times. My mother flew here to assist with that. In a few days, I'm leaving for the state of Bihar in India for another big trip. And this time we have a babysitter. We also have daycare. I cook a whole bunch and then freeze it in the. So there are ways that you can do it, but at the bottom line is that um, how do I feel justified really disrupting our family life to go to India for 3 weeks? Is that part of it is that I wrote this book that's fortunately selling well, and I can show that there's a tangible. It's not like it's difficult to explain, especially to explain to Italians, because it's difficult to say like, what am I doing in India? I don't know. I'm kind of like gathering experiences, but you have a book and you're able to look like all of this is contributed and it's flown into the pages of this book. So maybe I can't say I'm writing a book on India directly, but it will contribute and inform further projects. So it's getting easier too because he's 1.5, or 1.5 month, so 13 months. So he eats solid food, and it's Italy, so the family is really strong. My wife's grandmother lives 2 minutes down the road, and my wife's mother lives 5 minutes down the road.
Oh, wow, yeah, the
So
family is
there's no
definitely
shortage of
strong. So
help.
that kid is pretty set when it comes
Yeah.
to security. This
Mhm.
is awesome. So why don't we dive into the book now? So first of all, let me say that I was really fascinated by your writing style in the first place. The way you describe your experience, it literally travels, it makes the reader, it takes the reader into a traveling session, right? Like you have really good commands of the English language, and working on the book was honestly amazing. And I also want to congratulate you on your performance on the Tom Woods show. That was awesome. I watched it and I was really proud. And Tom Woods is a big fan of traveling too, so it was a great performance. So in the book, can you give a brief summary of the book to the audience first and foremost?
Yeah, first of all, really appreciate it from a prolific author such as yourself. I was like really trepidatious when I was reaching out to you because I was like, this guy's like a prodigy, and when he writes about history and economics, and like, what is he going to think of my little passion project? But no, I mean, first and foremost, I never went to school, and so I've had a lot of time to develop other skills and interests. And as a result of that, I've had a lot of like passion projects, things that I've done because it was important for me. But as soon as I realized that I was going to write a book, what I really didn't want it to be was just another thing for me. I wanted to create a product that was going to really represent Andrew Corbley as a professional man. So I knew I had to approach it in a way that was going to make sense productively, not just writing down these disparate. And when we say like experiences, that's such a broad term, and it can be as shallow as some of the travel content you see on Instagram, backpackers, but it can also be really profound. And that's what I wanted to do. I really wanted to like, I can't possibly be modest about this because at a certain point I have to accept that, I was aiming big and I wanted to really use the full breadth of the English language to do so. But I wanted to deliver a deep, meaningful description of the experiences that you have in foreign countries that would be great, that would greatly surpass the average reader's ability, even in their own minds, to
Well, I gotta
elaborate
say that you
on that.
successfully did that. You successfully did it because, as I said, like working on the book, like reading it, you literally travel with the reader. Like you take the reader on a trip with you because, like we literally thinking of all the places we like imagining ourselves, like all the places you've been to, and what was it like to be in your shoes at that moment in time, right?
Yeah, also because at a certain point, you've got to understand that you either have to be a great writer or you have to have something really unique to say because most people won't care what you have to say. Like, let's take Paris, for example. I don't write in the book about Paris, but like, why on earth would someone care about what I have to say about like the most famous city in Europe? Like, there's been hundreds of authors who have written about Paris who have way more experience of being a traveler in Paris than I do. So like also the place itself is famous. Like the interest in just reading about Paris for most people will be way more interesting than reading about what a random American traveler has to say about Paris. So excuse me, I'm coming off a cold here, but you've got to like take them to a place, put them there, but don't make it you know, the forefront of the explanation of the point you're trying to make or the theory you're trying to elaborate on. The destination or the narrow streets in the Medina in Tunisia is a writing utensil simply to better express your point. And I kind of think to a certain degree, that's what travel writing has to be because famous destinations are going to always be more interesting than what you necessarily have to say about it.
So in the book, there was one chapter that really caught my attention, and this is, of course, because I studied politics, so I'm sure you know the chapter I'm talking about. It is chapter 9, I believe. Let me look at the table of content real quick. If I'm not mistaken, it is, yeah, chapter 9, Politics and the Traveler.
Mm-hmm.
And in that chapter, you went deep. You talk about government a little bit, and there was one phrase that you say that I totally agree with. You said government produce nothing, and 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 yet, like, people still rely on it for a lot of things beyond, its regular functions. So can you talk a little bit about that chapter? So how politics affects you as a traveler, especially in a foreign land?
This is just a bit of backstory on that chapter. Was after I had kind of rounded off some of the really um, personal, deep experiences that I had and elaborated on them, I realized that I didn't have very much of a book at all. And what I really didn't want was like the book to seem like a collection of essays. So I tried to find some theme that could connect all of these chapters in a way that made it read like a book. And one of them was like, let's just look at really common aspects of human civilization through the eyes of how does it affect the traveler and how does the traveler affect it? So politics is inescapable, right? I mean, it's in the book I describe it as the doing, right? It's politics, the doing of polities, you know. So it's pretty inescapable. And I think that there are certain things in life that once you have a really good understanding of, life becomes a little bit like the end of the first Matrix film where Neo sees the world in like coding, right? Because it's a computer program. And politics is a little like that. And when you realize deep, profound political realities, like the fact that governments produce nothing, you do see the world a little bit in code. But the traveler can't escape the world of politics. Like maybe at home, you can say, well, no politics at the dinner table. I like to quip back that like, oh, well, yeah, maybe you have no interest in politics, but politics certainly has an interest in you. But and that's doubly important for the traveler because you're forced to, you know, tiptoe around these different societies in which all manner of strange things might be illegal, or they're other than illegality, there could be all these different kinds of processes for how to do things that might just be totally different, and it can frustrate you. And what another reason I wanted to take the reader's hand and explain like and show them how in many ways government simply is like a problem and an impediment. And you don't need to watch MSNBC to learn that. Traveling shows you just how deeply and negatively impactful the actions of governments can be on their citizens. And if you just talk to people in countries like, you go to a place like Tunisia, which I reference a lot in the book, it was a really profound trip, that one. But you realize like how bad it can get. Or for example, here in Italy, they don't have a treaty to recognize driver's licenses. So I had to go through, as a 28-year-old man with 12 years of driving experience, had to go back through driving school. There was no test material in English, but there was test material in French and German, because there are countries that are French and that speak French and German that are border Italy. But those countries have the treaties to recognize licenses, so they don't have to take the test anyway. So these are like the endless levels of frustration that you experience dealing with government in places where you don't have this like propagandized sense that you have some kind of control over this great beast. You know, like when you're in Tunisia and you're being bothered by the police, you don't have that self-righteous feeling of like, I pay your salary, or I voted for the guy who organized your district or something like that. You're just at the mercy of these people.
Yeah. Um, I have this question. So you've been to Africa, right? You've been to French-speaking countries and English-speaking countries. In your opinion, I mean, I have my own opinion on it, but I want to hear yours. In your opinion, like, what is the major difference between the two? I believe that English-speaking countries are way more advanced than French-speaking countries. What do you think is the factor, the decisive factor that makes English-speaking countries ahead of the French ones?
I think it's the language. The
Can you
reason I think
elaborate?
that is because obviously when Africa was being carved up by these two different empires, they were imparting their native, their language onto the natives. And the problem, what happened was, now look, you look at France today, and it's not, or like French-speaking countries like Belgium, it's not like they're in a bad way. France is not necessarily a difficult place to do business. What I think the problem was the people, the Africans who could speak and read French began to consume French literature. And I'm not sure that there is a, a, a world of literature where there were so many ideas that were so harmful to, perhaps in German, communism, Nazism, but no, like there were a lot of French, radical political thinkers who put out really emotionally convincing cases, but really intellectually shallow ones for things like greater central control of the economy or strange views of how, or like, for example, how politics is like a zero-sum game and it's all about power and seizing power. And what I think happened was it gave the French-speaking Africans a sense that, you know what, you had an episode of the Tom Woods Show where you contrasted the messages of W.E.B. Du Bois and another gentleman, I don't know if it was George Washington Carver.
Booker T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington. You describe how one of them was saying that Black Americans should use the power of neighborliness and productive capacities to advance themselves. And the other one, and W.E. Du Bois said, we should enter the educational system. And I think a similar thing happened between the French and the English-speaking Africans. It was the English-speaking Africans began to consume literature, which today is recognized as having great historical value. For example, I don't know how many Africans were reading The Wealth of Nations, but that was published in English, right? But Foucault and Jacques Derrida and those kinds of people, they were published in French. And it gave the French Africans a unnatural focus on the political realm. And I think that from what I've seen in the difference between them is they kind of traded away a lot of their economic freedoms for political freedoms that became largely meaningless because in a post-independence world, almost all of them got controlled by dictators anyway.
Yeah, and that you make a great point because that's exactly what happens with Black Americans is the trade, right? So Booker T. Washington was saying we need to focus on our productive capacity. It's by industrial education. So basically, vocational education that we can achieve self-sufficiency. And then W.E.B. Du Bois is saying no, it's through politics. We need vanguardism. Do you remember with the Soviets, Lenin? They had like a group of elite, intellectual, highly educated guys who would lead the Soviet working class. It was the same with Du Bois. They say, oh, we're going to lead the Black working class. We know better than them. So we're going to tell them what's best for them. And what's interesting is that people don't understand that, as you say, right? Government doesn't produce anything. And that's true. In fact, the essence of political power is negative power because it's based on coercion.
Mm-hmm.
So and that's the part that I don't understand about Du Bois. And I think perhaps he didn't even think it that way himself, but he did it inadvertently anyways. The question is, how can you expect a community to prosper by relying on punitive and restrictive power rather than productive and positive power, such as economic power? Because as I said again, political power is negative, is punitive. When you look at legislation, they always focus on things you cannot do. And Hayek talk about it in law legislation and liberty when he says that law it's more natural, it's like a spontaneous order. We know it's like unwritten rules, and then legislation is man-made. It's focused on things that we're not allowed to do. And yet, and that's what politics is about. And you see someone like Jabori and the French-speaking countries, different African-speaking countries, they all think that politics is the way to achieve self-sufficiency and prosperity.
Yeah, I think first of all, I wanted to just comment on that. Like, yeah, in the same real way that once you know that politics doesn't produce anything, you begin to see it for what it really is. That's another point, is like you just like go look at the press release area, like go to a government department, even a really nice one. Like if I were suddenly the president of the United States, I would certainly focus on rolling back everything before like the Department of the Interior, because they do nice things. They manage the national parks, whatever. But even if you go to like their press releases, just see what are they doing that does not fall into the category of spending or banning, because that's about all they can do, right? And I think one of the problems that have you traveled a lot in Africa? Obviously, you are from the West.
Yeah, so I lived in Kenya for 4 years. That's why I learned English. I used to go in Tanzania too because my dad worked there. But I've been to Ethiopia. I would say not much at all. Like I'm not a big traveler. I mean, I've traveled, don't get me
Uh-huh.
wrong, but I'm not like a big traveler. And back then I was like also super young, so I wasn't super observant of, like cultural contrast.
Hmm. I found that like Africans are pretty much just like everybody else, um, when it comes to how they view civil association. But one thing I found, and I'm not, I haven't traveled very much there. I've been Morocco, Tunisia, Ghana, Namibia, and I found that they were just like you and I when considering their own politicians. But when they would talk about the politicians from other like Europe and North America, they would change their tune. They would become much more kind of appreciative. And I think one of the yeah, it's like they don't realize it's two heads of the same beast.
Yeah.
And I think like it's really popular and mm, attractive to have to the idea of like representing a 21st century Africa in Europe, discussions with Southeast Asia that's developing very, very fast. There's a kind of like sense like it's like Africa's like the coming man. And I think that is dragging a disproportionate number of Africans into politics because they see the influence of the continent emerging more and more on a world stage, and they want to be a part of that. When I think what would probably benefit them more is if they looked to model what Japan did. Japan was not a political entity in the second half of the 20th century.
Mhm.
They became part of the G7 because they spent 50 years with their head down, inventing really great and cheap ways to make hatchbacks and
Yeah,
CD
building
players and stuff
cars
like
and
that.
basically revitalizing the entire economy. Absolutely.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of different cultures in Africa, and some of them take better I've found to like free market messaging.
Mhm.
And I think I try to do my own little part by explaining to them the benefits of it. And
Mhm.
hopefully as I can't remember who said it. It was a libertarian who said, he he said, if we all light our own little candles of liberty, one candle doesn't create a lot of light in the darkness, but if we all light our own little candle, it'll light up the world.
Yeah,
So
it's
try to do my part.
yeah, no, absolutely. And there's some cultures who just aren't prone to entrepreneurship and free market ideas. For example, when you look at in Nigeria, you look at the Igbos and the Hausas. The Igbos are perhaps the wealthiest Africans living, even the wealthiest blacks living in the United States. They're like the most educated. They're actually financially very wealthy. And then you have the Hausas who don't have any incentive to produce. And one thing and to come back a little bit on the French versus the English, one thing I noticed, and I'm from Ivory Coast originally, French-speaking countries. One thing I noticed about the French is that they spend a lot more than they produce. They always borrow from English-speaking countries. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if you noticed, but at the time of Louis the 14th, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe Louis the 16th, is one of those two kings. The Minister of Finance of France at the time was a Scottish guy, John Law. He was the one who kind of like speculate on the Mississippi bubble. And he was a Scottish guy. So the point is to say the French are so bad at economics and finance that they have to hire a Scottish man, like an Englishman,
Yeah,
right? An
yeah.
English, like a British man to do the finance for them. And this is one thing because like, and Roman speaking languages, so French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, they're very good at when it comes to the social aspect, literature, social, everything that deals with social and the social science in general. But when it comes to finance, accounting, economics, anything that deals with numbers, they can do it. And Americans and British people are the opposite. They're extremely good with with money. If you look at the most powerful stock markets in the world are all in English speaking countries. Right? Like you look at the most powerful stock market is the New York Stock Exchange. Then you have the London Stock Exchange. Both speak English. In West Africa, for example, you have one stock exchange for all West African French-speaking countries. So that tells you that, and to me, that's why the French are behind and they will always be behind.
Yeah, I think, I actually got that truth firsthand because when I visited Ghana, I stayed with my connection to the country was a banker.
Right?
And I learned about the ECOWAS,
Yeah.
sphere. And he was, kind of explaining how all the ECOWAS countries borrow from Senegal, and then Senegal borrows from Europe. It's
Yeah.
just like a lot of borrowing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you know what it is? It's like I live in a Latin speaking country, right? That has had huge, multiple times in the last 100 years has had extreme difficulties keeping their books in order. And there's a real sense like that certain things are beyond. And I know we've stayed now on like economics for quite a while, but like there's a sense from Italians that like there's a good deal of human life that should be beyond the realm of like numbers and calculation.
Yeah.
Like this is human right. This is, it's a human right. It's a societal good. It's for the common good. It's something that we deserve because we live in an organized state that's compassionate. They have all of these ideas and stuff, but yeah, I just think that it was, man, it really was like that. It's frustrating at times because it's easy to explain why countries that speak English or countries that follow a little more laissez-faire model do better. Like, you know, just it's like, it's such a simple equation. Like, taxes remove productive capacity from businesses and give them to people who are far less productive. You're taking resources and more proportionately from the people proven to be the best at generating them and giving them often to the people who are the worst at generating them. And that's like an A, B, like it's not like a long string of X plus B divided by Y. Like, it's a really simple thing. But yeah, it's just difficult to get through to people here. There is a belief that the government has to function as like a great provider.
Yeah.
You find that a lot in a lot of countries, but it's really strong in poor countries, ironically.
Yeah, very. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, we came to the end of this first part of this episode, and stay tuned. We will come back to talk about why Andrew got into libertarianism, and we will also talk about his writing process as an author. We will be back. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the GGV Publishing Podcast. And we are here for part 2 with Andrew Corbley. So, Andrew, you are a libertarian, right? Politically, philosophically, economically, you lean libertarian. What drove you to libertarianism in the first place?
Warehousing is the easiest way to say it.
How come?
Well, because if you're a talentless youth and you need money, you either work in a restaurant or, in my case, you go into warehousing. And I don't know how many young people are listening, but I would seriously recommend the latter, because not only do you get a view on what a real large corporate entity is like that you don't get in a restaurant, but you have just so much more time to yourself to think, to dream, to plan, or in my case, to listen to podcasts. And I very much am a child of the podcast generation. And I don't know exactly where my brother got the libertarian message from first, because we had all grown up in a Democratic household, Democrat by, like, just because nobody had bothered to. My mother was a video journalist in Washington, D.C., and my father worked for public broadcasting. So they were real, like, classic, great society Democrats. And we just listened to, that message. And then one day my brother just started spouting off about how great Ron Paul was and libertarianism and stuff. So I don't know which podcast he got it from, but it must have been a podcast, because where else could it have possibly just like blown into his, sphere of intellect? And he said something stupid and or no, it wasn't stupid, but he said that, like, everybody's a libertarian, they just don't know it yet. And
yeah, I heard that a lot.
you know what? Do you know what? I was a young man who always really tried to hold values that were higher than himself. And at that particular time in my life, I was really focused on like intellectualism, just in general, like anything that required a high degree of like abstraction was something I thought was just generally important. And one of those principles was like, looking at arguments objectively and capitulating to superior reasoning and looking at things with an objective and non-emotional mind. And so if you really do that, everybody is if everybody did that, everybody would be a libertarianism because the arguments are, just completely superior. And we've already gone over some of them already. I myself being a passionate person, it was difficult for me to do anything halfway. And I suppose all the political fervor that has people marching in the street over any number of issues drove me to, consume a really outsized amount of libertarian history and philosophy and tradition over the succeeding 3 or 4 years. Then I moved to Italy, which was funny and kind of ironic because Italy is about on the other side of the spectrum from any kind of small limited government.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and libertarians, when it comes to abstract reasoning, I think they're the best. They provide the best argument because it's logically consistent. And if you take things to the logical conclusions, you would end up being an ANCAP. But that's the abstract part, but there is also the realistic part. Like sometimes, like libertarians can be quixotic at times, it depends. And that's where there's a lot of like infighting and everything. I don't know if you look online, but you see a lot of infighting among libertarians.
No, I don't because I try to look for my mental health. I can't like immerse myself in a world online that is so non-existent in my physical world. Like I have to I have to be of a mind state that allows me to live in Italy. And so part of that is involved just like trying to leave certain desires. Like you have the libertarian philosophy, this beautiful thing. You want to do something with it.
Yeah.
I've had to kind of relinquish the desire to do something with it.
Let me ask you this. On the libertarian spectrum, where do you actually lean? Are you an ANCAP? Are you a minarchist? Are you there's even libertarian communists, like people create all sort of ideologies, but where where do you lean exactly in the libertarian spectrum?
I think, yeah, I'm a pacifist. So my libertarianism comes mostly from a desire to remove what I see as the greatest cause of misery in the human condition. So I don't, that in itself, I mean, what do you even do with that philosophical position, that desire, right? So I don't really bother to like consider too heavily about libertarian in the realm of law because I don't understand law so well or social things. I try to preach libertarianism and live libertarianism as a way to reduce violence in the world. And look, like I understand exactly the libertarian position on gun control, the war on drugs, you know, environmental regulation, like all these things. I can perfectly explain to you why the government being in the way is completely hazardous to well-being and prosperity. So it's not like I'm those things, and those things are all important, right? Like we need everybody with libertarian minds need to do what we have to paddle against the current in so many ways. So whatever keeps you paddling is what you should be focusing on. But for me, really, it is it's the warfare state. And I hate it with every fiber of my lungs. And that's what I try to like. And that's a great message too for an international as I am, to be like anytime an Italian says like, well, what do you think of the pensions in America? And I'm like, you know what, man? The money that pays for the pensions pays for the nuclear weapons program. So just let me starve on the street as an old man. I don't care. Like you've got to do what you're passionate about. And that's the thing that will always, always, always get a rouse out of me, is like seeing money spent on war or seeing people manipulated to fight conflicts. So whether I'm a minarchist or whatever, it's like I call myself a libertarian pacifist.
Got it. That's definitely clear. Speaking of the welfare state, since this is the thing that bothers you the most, if you were to get rid of it, how would you go about it?
I mean, that is, I think one of the things that really made me love libertarian philosophy was how it dealt with war and state making, which is kind of dirty and ironic. It's a little dirty and ironic because we don't believe in the state. But reading about the history of how states form was like endlessly fascinating to me. Now, vis-a-vis getting rid of the warfare state, I think that would be getting rid of the state. Because if you look at the history of state building, war making kind of goes hand in hand. There's a great essay by a British limited government mind. I think his name was James Tully. It's called War Making and State Making as a Mafia, which is just what a raw title, you know, like, but he talks about how, and Lysander Spooner talks about this as well in his book about the Constitution. The state needs war in order to expand, and in the most perverted way, if two states are at war, right? There are only two ways a nation state can collapse: through internal revolt or through external conquest. But the benefit of the latter is both nation states are simultaneously and in effect recognizing each other's dominion over their subjects by going to war, right? It's not just that war is the health of the state because they're able to exploit the resources of the society they control to the maximum amount, but if France and Germany are at war with each other, the governments, by doing so, inherently acknowledge one's control over the other. And the fact that in this incredibly emotional cauldron, such as a war, they get to bend the citizenry's mind into thinking that the French government has a right to send the French people to war, and the German government has a right to send the German people to war. So war is one of the two or three things that gives a state its legitimacy. I'm actually writing a travel-focused fantasy fiction, and in it, I talk about a political climate in which all of the kings and the dukes and the sultans come up with this, like, there's this political ideology of which, by recognizing each other as sovereign, they are helping guarantee, even though that doesn't necessarily allow them to conquer each other so easily, it greater solidifies their own control, because everyone else in the world says, no, you control those people that you live next to or among. You know, we have no qualms with that. And war does that. So if you want to remove the warfare state, you kind of have to remove the state as such. So that's how I see it, at least.
Quick question. That fiction you're working on, are you gonna publish GGV or with someone else? I had to put you
I
on
don't
the
know,
spot
man. I
there.
don't think you'd publish fantasy fiction, but
We
we'll
actually
have to see.
do. We actually open the fiction service now. So we
Great.
publish like dystopian, uh, dystopian historical fiction and fictional biographies. So, you know, check the website and
Okay.
let's see if
We'll
it
talk
fits.
about it
I mean,
later.
based
Yeah.
on what you said, looks like it fits, but I had to put you on the spot with that. um, so yeah, so what you said is very interesting. That in order to remove the welfare state, you got to remove the state in itself. And you live in Europe, and I realize that especially continental Europe, they love the welfare state. You cannot imagine continental Europe without the social system. And I think it is the reason why continental Europe is behind the British Isles and the United States. I think that's why continental Europe will never catch up. Because the funny thing is that continental Europe was the most powerful region in the world for centuries. And today, don't get me wrong, like those countries still have wealth, but they I don't think they can ever catch up to the British Isles or to the US or even Australia, all these countries. And so in your opinion, do you think the state should be completely abolished, or do you believe that there's still some functions that we should keep of the government? That do you think that government is still necessary, but it should be like extremely limited?
Do you know what? I really buy the argument that if you were going to suggest that the state has some relevance, and should carry on with some small functions, and then you think about what those functions would be, and you think, well, what are the most like foundational parts of a society? You might say banking or law or common defense, and then you think about the incredible importance of those things, and you're like, why would you leave those up to the most corrupt, dysfunctional organization in your society, right? Why would you get the government out of every social regulatory function? Just give them control of the courts. Are you mad? The courts are like one of the most important part of a society. So I do think that, like, I do have this theory though that we talk about, private property rights is not just not just the basis of libertarian philosophy. It's more or less the basis of all Western civilization, the idea that you can actually own something. Um, there's a certain degree to which I feel like government's only function should be enforcing the private property rights of God vis-a-vis the spectacular natural creations that he's left us with. Because, I think the history of America has shown that there are certain things that would have become perhaps irreversibly tarnished, such as the Yellowstone Valley or the Grand Canyon. Like, I think there was a company that had, before the Grand Canyon was under jurisdiction, they were going to turn part of the South Rim into a copper pit. So there's a part of me that feels like the only part of the government that should exist should be the Department of, essentially the National Park Service. Only because there are certain things that once, like, if you allow someone to log a sequoia tree, 2,000 years of humanity don't get to see that tree again. So, and whether we can have an argument about whether, like, there are tons, don't get me wrong, I'm not as fool about this. There are tons of great private organizations that are able to conserve natural beauty and irreplaceable natural features. And there are tons of government agencies that allow natural features to be exploited. I do just think, though, that the American conservation, the story of American conservation shows that government intervention has, at certain times, preserved certain features that would have been irreplaceable if lost. And so if you were to say that the state should exist in any capacity, you might say that would be it. But what does a state made up entirely of the Department of the Interior look like? Are they armed? How do they enforce the laws that, so, you know, it becomes very shady and abstract at that point, I think.
Yeah, I think they'll definitely be armed because remember the essence of political power is coercion, physical coercion. So definitely, you know, they there's no state a without physical coercion.
Yeah,
Um,
and then they would have to have some, you know, like who would make the law to say that you can't cut a sequoia tree down, and then who would enforce the law, and then if there were just men with guns and no control over the law, what would the men with guns say coming to arrest you for cutting the sequoia tree down? So at that point, it becomes very, you know, you can't kind of have one without the other. I'm
absolutely.
saying if there was ever a function in society in which there needed to be a group of men beyond reproach for their actions, it might be those who make sure that, you know, all the wolves aren't shot, you know, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'd like to talk about writing a little bit. So you're an author, you publish a wonderful book. Uh, Publishing a book is, I know it's something that has always been in people's minds, but it's not everyone that can do it. So I always say that uh every author is a writer, but not every writer is an author. And you are an author, you publish a book. What was your writing process to get this book to fruition, to bring this book to fruition?
Okay, well, I think, first of all, every book will be different. And so I think an author who wants to prepare one book may find it useful to maybe start writing at the end of the book, start writing his conclusion before writing the reasoning toward it. Perhaps with other people, it's very much a case of they need to write the book in a perfectly linear fashion because they need to keep their thoughts organized. But authorship is an extremely mentally intensive exercise, and you need to keep your thoughts focused in a way that can be difficult for some people. When it came to this book, I just wanted to see, I started with one idea and I finished with another, which was, you know, I started thinking I could write an interesting introspective into the nature of traveling and the headspace that you get in while traveling. But I realized that wasn't going to produce anything large enough, essentially. And so then I had to expand my original thesis. And I'm sort of, if you think about doing that with a building, right? If you were building a tall convention, you know, like building a convention center, and then halfway through it you realize you had to like change the whole idea of what the convention center was going to be, that might be a huge challenge. So I'm kind of lucky it turned out as good as it did, but you know, essentially what I wanted to do was how could I connect? Yeah, I had a few objectives. That might be a good way to say it. Was I wanted to explore certain deeply intellectual, emotional experiences that I had, elaborate their meaning, connect them with relevance to examples that I had experienced in the real world in various countries, inspire people. And then I realized that wasn't going to be enough. So then I added like, well, why stop at just personal experiences? Why don't we talk about religion? Why don't we talk about war? Why don't we talk about time? Why don't we talk about the perception of states and the prevalence of cultures and things like that? And I thought, yeah, that could make a nice book. And I didn't want it to sound like a collection of essays. I think by and large, I accomplished that, despite some of the chapters being a bit small. And that's kind of how I proceeded. And then the last thing that I really focused on was like, damn it, Andy, do not just like walk around with this manuscript. Like I wrote a book. Oh yeah, where can I buy it? Well, it's not published. I didn't want to be that proverbial LA script writer who's walking around like, I have a script. Do you want to read it? So I knew that from the moment I started, I had to like really keep my eye on the idea that this was going to become something that somebody could buy. And I'm actually really proud to say that from the first drafts to the moment I signed a contract with GGV Publishing Company, that was like 4 months, which is, a really short. I think a lot of people might need longer to write a book, but fortunately I had been mulling a lot of the content of the book had been in my mind for a long time, and I had already elaborated it personally, to a great degree.
Absolutely. And honestly, as I said again, like you wrote a fantastic book. It was a pleasure to read it.
Thank you so much, dude.
What I'm curious about is, did you develop a writing schedule while you were working on the manuscript? Because I know that this is one thing that people have a lot of trouble. As I said, everyone want to write a book. Some people get really excited about the idea of writing a book and then they start writing. But then they stumble when they get writer's block. So they have trouble to commit and they never finish the manuscript. So that's the first question. Actually, that should be the second question. The first question was, once you knew that you were going to write the book, did you develop an outline or you just went straight up? You're like, screw this, I'm just gonna write this.
I think I did. What I just said, finished saying, that was kind of my outline, was setting objectives, realizing how I could connect these disparate elements and coming up with a kind of grander theme. So I'll go straight to the second question, which was, it's delicate. It's a little like a relationship. You need to know when to push and you need to know when to lay back, because you don't want to like, some writers will say, and it's not like I'm a super expert anyway, like I've only met a few authors. Anyway, it's not like everybody's creative motor is going to go at a similar RPM. So if you are the kind of person who feels they have to write every day, some authors will say, like, whatever it is, even if it's just 100 words, you've got to keep the ideas in your head. You've got to keep the flow. You've got to keep it moving.
I'm that type.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm that
Okay.
type. Yeah.
But then I think maybe because I was writing a really kind of sensitive, where I wanted the concepts to be as clean and neatly organized as possible. I felt there is a risk if I go like 2 or 3 days without writing, but I don't want to just like begin to just write for writing's sake and fill up the book with a lot of half elaborated concepts. Because I also had to realize the value of what I had already in my head and in my journals from traveling. I was like, some of the material that you said, created a wonderful book, is like, those were written, after an amazing experience. They are on the ground in my journal, on the train ride, on the old Soviet steam train, like they were written in that moment. And so I realized, like, if I were chewing them up over days of trying to push myself to make the book bigger, make it, elaborate this more, this chapter can't just be 8 pages, like I realized that every step I got away from that original material was one step away from the emotional origin of those thoughts, which occurred at the moment that I had them. So I tried not to just fill the book up. I also realized, like going back to the beginning of our conversation, that if I started to just like create new ideas on the spot to fill up the book with, then at a certain point, instead of 12 profound ideas, there might be 10 profound ideas, 3 profound ideas that aren't very well elaborated, and then 8 ideas that are clearly just fluff. So that's my writing style is delicate. It's knowing when to know if I can't think of what to write, find out why. Because in theory, if you understand your concept down to your heart, you shouldn't get writer's block. So if nothing was coming out, I'd stop and ask myself, why? Is that because I haven't thought about this enough? Is there a flaw in this reasoning? Is there a contradiction? Or are you not really being true to your own message and you're just trying to create, filler?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I encountered writer's block pretty much in every book that I've worked on. I I wrote 27 books. There is actually a 28th on the way. And for each of them, I had like writer's block at least between 3 and 5 times. But that was because I think I was sort of like burning out. Because I'm a guy like, yeah, because I'm a guy like, the minute I get the idea of what I'm going to write about, the first thing I do to commit myself to it is the outline. So I create an outline, I write the abstract, a paragraph, maybe to making sure it's like at most 250 words. Elaborate the chapters. Okay, for chapter 1, this is my argument, or this is my thesis, chapter 2, and so on and so forth. And then I start writing, and I write every day. Because to me, like, because we all have our ways of dealing with relapse. I feel like if I don't write every day, it will be hard for me uh finish, to go to the completion. I mean, at this point, now I don't write every day, especially that I'm running GGV Publishing. It's a lot of work. Like, you guys are my clients, so your work come first. But I don't like have to write every day at this point. At first, like the first few books, yes. Now I've like what, 27, like almost 28. I don't even have to write books anymore, but I just enjoy doing it.
Do you feel like because you're writing about sometimes historical, sometimes when I say academic, I mean like there's a theory, there's a science to what you're writing about. So you've got like a reservoir of material to draw from. Do you feel like that makes writer's block kind of more severe or less severe? Because less severe because there's a lot more you can draw on, but more severe because it's not necessarily like yours.
That's a good question. I would say it goes both ways. It goes both ways because it can be more severe because I know it's not mine, and sometimes I would like to make my own arguments, like, okay, yes, like, you use the argument of someone, then you built on it. But at the same time, like, I want to make my own argument and I'm blocking on it. I'm like, I can't make it. And it frustrates me. That's when that's when the writer's block is severe. It's less severe when I have a lot of reservoir. Like, I have close to 1,000 books in my personal library. I have a lot of books. So, and I also do a lot of research online. So I know that there's always ideas flowing. And sometimes it's more about like the structure, how I'm going to structure this argument, because the argument is there, but if the structure is not correct, or if the argument is not structured correctly, you will fail to convey the message you want, the way you want to convey to the reader, and the reader will understand you. So yeah, writer's block, I've always encountered that. It's But now it's less compared to the first 2 or 3 books that I wrote. But it's something that I always encounter because I also work on like very convoluted topics. For example, I wrote a book on actually a 2-volume book on a history of wealth distribution in the US. That was massive.
Yeah.
And I was working on it every single day. I was like, I gotta finish this.
Yeah, that's that's certainly I have so much respect for that because I feel like those histories are so they feel like the professional, it's like the major leagues compared to AA baseball. You know, like I'm hitting AA baseball and you're like, because those are the things that, you know, really push. I don't know. It's the kind of histories I really like. Like I also read, you know, I read a lot. I try to read as much as I can, and
Yeah.
it's difficult because I have a lot of disparate appreciations. But I love those kind of like 5,000 years of Chinese civilization, or you know, like just like those big monumental
Yeah,
histories.
actually there was one author at GGV who published a comprehensive analysis of Chinese history. His name is Christian De Luca. Yeah, he's a specialist on Chinese history. And he went all the way to like 5,000 years back. His book like is
Yeah.
over 500 pages. It's a pretty heavy book. Yeah, but it's really fascinating. Like reading it, I was like, oh my God, the guy went deep into the research. It was absolutely fascinating working on it and reading it, and yeah, it was a great analysis. And that was like a pure product of historical analysis.
Yeah, I read another one about like there was a great history I read called The Pursuit of Glory. It was like 5 revolutions that made modern Europe. And that one, I pulled some references of that from my book about things like what traveling was like in a world in a Europe without paved roads. And it was just like our conception of travel is funny because we think of travel as the moment at which we get off of an airplane, you know, like, but for like if you just go back 200 years and you wanted to like go across Italy, you would be in a stagecoach for like 7 weeks. And you think of like, you want to go to like Brindisi because you want to take it, let's say you're taking a boat, you're going to Greece or something, or you want to go to Rimini, you're from Milan, you want to go to Rimini. So you're in a stagecoach for like 2.5 weeks, and that's hotel and food every night for like 2 weeks before you even start the travel. Whereas us, the traveling moment is the one that takes a few hours, and then
Yeah,
there's the travel part. But as soon as the people like then left their house, it was like you were already in the thick of it.
yeah, absolutely.
So I love those historical perspectives, especially like this is what I'm going to read in India is this book here is The Travels of Pietro della Valle, who was a Roman guy who just went all across Asia in the 1600s and wrote an incredibly detailed account of it. And I love those histories of people just writing exactly what they see as they see it. And there was fortunately enough people throughout history to do that, to create a whole genre of it, because it's absolutely, for me, it's riveting stuff.
Absolutely. Well, here we come to the end of this episode. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the GGV Publishing Podcast. It was a long time coming episode. We've been working together for a couple months now, and finally you came to the podcast. I really appreciate it. And
Yeah.
can you tell the audience before we go where they can find you or where they can read your work?
So I write every day for 2 news websites. The first is called goodnewsnetwork.org. It's the Google's number one ranking for positive journalism. and I write every day there. And then I have my own website called worldatlarge.news, where I publish on a more broader array of topics, emotionally speaking, such as conflicts. But that's also where I do all of my travel writing, apart from obviously in the book. I've started to kind of expand my portfolio of services. So there's like a free ebook you can get on worldatlarge.news as well. And I'm selling my travel photography at worldatlarge.pickfair.com. So you can buy for cheap, you can buy really high quality framed prints of my photographs if you have an interest in that. So I'm just trying to put all of that experience in the world into a greater entrepreneurial work. But
Awesome.
yeah, at worldatlarge.news is a great place you can find me. I just redid the website recently. It's great. It's much more user friendly. So
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. I will put all of that down in the description. And I will see you guys soon. Awesome.